Good morning, boys and girls. Welcome back for another chapter in Flat Stanley. Now, the Magic Treehouse books always took place in one location, where Flat Stanley has taken you to a variety of places. The first one, just in his bedroom when the bulletin board fell on him. The second chapter was down a sewer, as well as he was mailed to California in an envelope and mailed back. And chapter 3 actually took you to the park where he was a kite. So today he is taking you to an art museum. And as you can tell over my shoulder, I have a very famous painting here. It is called the Mona Lisa, and it was painted over 500 years ago by Leonardo da Vinci. You can now find the original painting in the Louvre Museum in Paris, France. Now, you know Mrs. Cogo comes upon treasures now and then, so I don't want to tell where all my treasure hunts take me. So, I have the Mona Lisa. Another piece of art over here was done by a much less famous person, we'll say. Denise Malott is the name on that piece of art. And it's done in dots, which are called pointillism. So this entire picture is just made of dots. And then, of course, down here, I have a little painting, a little copy of McGuffey's Readers. And it was by M. Gickus. And I couldn't find out much information about that painting. So you know how I like my art. So I will go ahead and begin chapter 4, which is called The Museum Thieves. Mr. and Mrs. O.J. Dart lived in the apartment above the lamb chops. Mr. Dart was an important man. He was the director of a famous museum of art downtown in the city. Stanley Lambchop had noticed in the elevator that Mr. Dart, who was ordinarily a very cheerful man, had become quite gloomy. But he had no idea what the reason might be. And then at breakfast one morning, he heard Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop talking about Mr. Dart. "I see," said Mr. Lambchop, reading the paper over his cup of coffee, "that still another painting has been stolen from the famous museum. It says here that Mr. O.J. Dart, the director, is at his wit's end about it." "Oh dear, are the police being of no help?" Mrs. Lambchop asked. "Well, it seems they can't catch the thieves," said Mr. Lambchop. "Listen to what the chief of police told the newspaper. We suspect it is a gang of sneak thieves. These are the worst kind. They work by sneakery, which makes them very difficult to catch. However, my men and I, we are going to keep on trying. Meanwhile, I hope people will buy tickets for the policeman's ball and not park their cars where the signs say no parking." The next morning, Stanley Lambchop heard Mr. Dart talking to his wife in the elevator. "These sneak thieves work at night," Mr. Dart said. "It is very hard for our guards to stay awake when they've been on duty all day. And the famous museum is so big we cannot guard every picture at the same time. I fear it is hopeless, hopeless, hopeless." Suddenly, as if an electric light bulb had been lit above Stanley's head, giving out a little shout of excitement, Stanley Lambchop told his idea to Mr. Dart. "Stanley," Mr. Dart said, "if your mother will give you permission, I will put you and your plan to work this very night." Mrs. Lambchop gave her permission. "But you will have to take a long nap this afternoon," she said. "I cannot have you up till all hours of the night unless you do." That evening, after a long nap, Stanley went with Mr. Dart to the famous museum. Mr. Dart took him into the main hall where the biggest and most important paintings were hung. He pointed to a huge painting that showed a bearded man wearing a floppy velvet hat, playing a violin for a lady who lay on a couch. There was a half-man, half-horse person standing behind them, and 3 children with wings were flying above. That, Mr. Dart explained, was the most expensive painting in the world. There was an empty picture frame on the opposite wall. We shall hear more about that later on. Mr. Dart took Stanley into his office and said, "It is time for you to put on your disguise." "I already thought of that," Stanley Lambchop said, "and I brought one. My cowboy suit. It has a red bandana that I can tie over my face. Nobody will recognize me in a million years." "No," Mr. Dart said. You will wear a disguise that I have chosen for you." From the closet, he took out a white dress with a blue sash, a pair of shiny little pointed shoes, and a wide straw hat with a blue band that matched the sash, and a wig and a stick. The wig was made of blonde hair, long and done in ringlets. The stick was curved at the top, and it too had a blue ribbon on it. "In this shepherdess disguise," Mr. Dart said, "you will look like a painting that belongs in the main hall. We do not have any cowboy pictures in the main hall." Stanley was so disgusted by this disguise, he could hardly speak. I will look like a girl." "That's what I will look like," he said. "I wish I'd never come up with this idea." But Stanley was a good sport and wanted to help Mr. Dart, so he put on the disguise. Back in the main hall, Mr. Dart helped Stanley climb in to the empty picture frame. Suddenly, Stanley was able to stay in place because Mr. Dart had carefully put 4 little pegs in the wall, one for each hand and one for each foot. The frame was a perfect fit. Against the wall, Stanley looked just like a picture. "Except for one thing," Mr. Dart said. "Shepherdesses are supposed to look happy. They smile at their sheep and they look at the sky. They look quite content. Not fierce or unhappy, Stanley." So Stanley tried to get a faraway look in his eyes and even seemed to smile a little bit. Mr. Dart stood back a few feet and stared at him for a moment. "Well," he said, "it may not be art, but I know what I like." He went off to make certain that the other parts of Stanley's plan had been taken care of, and Stanley was left alone. It was very dark in the main hall. A little bit of moonlight came through the windows, and Stanley could just make out the world's most expensive painting on the opposite wall. He felt as though the bearded man with the violin and the lady on the couch and the half-person and the winged children were just all waiting, as he was, to see what might happen. Time passed, and he got more tired and more tired. Anyone would be tired that late at night, especially if you had to stand on a picture frame balancing on little wooden pegs. Maybe they won't come, Stanley thought. Maybe the sneak thieves won't come at all tonight. The moon went behind a cloud, and then the main hall was pitch dark. It seemed to get quieter and quieter, too. There was absolutely no sound at all. Stanley felt the hair on the back of his neck prickle beneath the golden curls of his wig. Creak, creak. The sound came from right out of the middle of the main hall, and even as he heard it, Stanley saw, in a small place, a little tiny yellow glow of light. The creaking came again, and the glow got bigger. A trap door had opened in the floor, and 2 men came through it into the hall. Stanley understood everything perfectly now. That must be the sneak thieves, and the trap door was the entrance in the museum from the outside. That is why they'd never been caught, and now tonight they were back to steal the most expensive painting in the world. He held very still in his picture frame and listened to the sneak thieves. "This is it, Max," said the first one. This is where we art robbers pull a sensational job while the rest of the community sleeps." "Right, Luther," said the other man. "In all this great city, no one is going to suspect us." "Ha ha," thought Stanley Lambchop. "That's what you think." The thieves put down their lantern and took the world's most expensive painting off the wall. "What would we do to anyone who tried to capture us, Max?" the first man said. "Well, I'm not sure," his friend replied. Oh, but Stanley was still frightened. He was even more frightened when Luther came over and stared at him. "This sheep girl," Luther said. "I thought sheep girls were supposed to smile, Max. This one looks a little bit scared." Just in time, Stanley managed to get a faraway look in his eyes and smile again. "Well, sort of." "You're crazy, Luther," Max said. "She's smiling, and what a pretty little thing she is, too." Well, that made Stanley furious. He waited until the sneak thieves had turned their back with the world's most expensive painting, and he shouted in his loudest, most terrifying voice, "Police! Police! Mr. Dart, the sneak thieves are here!" The sneak thieves looked at each other. "Max," said the first one very quietly, "I think that sheep girl just yelled at us." "I think I heard it too," Max said in a quivering voice. "Oh boy, I think we need some rest. We think the paintings are talking to us." "You'll get all the rest you need," shouted Mr. Dart, rushing in with the police chief and lots of guards and policemen behind them. "You will get arrested. That's what. Ha ha ha." The sneak thieves were too mixed up by Mr. Dart's joke and too frightened by the police to put up a fight. Before they knew it, they had been taken away. The next morning in the office of the police chief, Stanley Lambchop got a medal. The day after, his picture was put in all the newspapers. Stanley Lambchop had become quite famous. And that's the end of chapter 4. Come back tomorrow for chapter 5 and the last one called Arthur's Good Idea. And thank you again for joining me in my little art museum. Thanks again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.